Few minutes late, but let's go ahead and start since we have a quorum. It is 5:04 p.m. We're meeting Lexington Planning Commission, May 25th. First thing is we're calling to order, and now we're going to approve the agenda.
I move that we approve the agenda as presented.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Now let's go to the approval of the minutes from the May 11th, 2023 meeting.
Did all of you each have a handout?
Yeah. Well, I move that we approve the minutes as presented,
Second,
As presented or
presented or
revised? Yeah.
or as well as they are in here. You have a different.
A new one
Sorry.
just came out.
When did these amendments? We're just seeing, are we seeing this for the first time?
Yeah,
Okay,
sorry,
gotcha.
I take it back.
I don't know if this was emailed or something.
this
but-
was something that I submitted at 4:23 on Tuesday. I'm joking. Slightly after
Fine.
4. I thought it was important to clarify the discussion on the bylaws, and so these are just small amendments I'm requesting. I listened to the audio and I think this. The important thing is that for me, the purpose statements I've highlighted in there suggested adding text to describe the role of the planning commission more fully regarding subdivision amendments, zoning and comprehensive plan. And then to tie up a long discussion at the end, I think we agreed that I would go back and look if there was additional language I wanted to bring back to the commission in the future regarding the comprehensive plan, we could discuss that.
All right. That looks good to me.
May I? Should there be a question mark after that? In your amended,
This is just the minutes though, right?
like, yeah. Does that mean anything or was that intentional?
Where I'm at,
He then pointed out the changes to the purpose section proposed by John Driscoll that. Comma.
you can take that out.
I didn't understand. I didn't know if I'm just missing something.
No,
So that's the
no,
only reason I
you always happy
Oh,
to make it
I just
clear.
didn't- I just-
I got you. The just the punctuation.
Yeah,
I got you. Okay.
I just didn't understand it.
I think Grammarly gave it to me. I shouldn't have paid attention.
That's good. It shows you should have been using one of these word generators.
All right. So there's amendments. Anybody want to approve the
Second.
amended?
I move to approve the amended minutes.
Second.
All in favor?
I
Great. Next item is citizens' comments on matters not on the agenda. Okay, I don't see anybody moving forward to speak on this section, so let's close that and go to item 5, new business. We're going to continue discussions with zoning ordinance amendment 2023-01 annual zoning ordinance amendment for accessory dwelling units. Arnie, let us know where we're leaving off and what our goals for the day are.
If we could pick up on page 17 with nonconformities, I'm hoping we could perhaps get through nonconformities and also review, and maybe some of the materials in the appendix will help with your discussion on nonconformities. So hopefully we can get through those two things, and then at the next meeting, we can bring back to you first draft, really.
Okay,
Page, did you say, Lauren? 17.
Page 17 of your packet. So with the nonconformities that are listed there, there are subsections 1 through 3. Just to sort of go through, the first one what would we do with an illegal accessory apartment? And we're again talking about just accessory structures, so detached buildings. What if we had one that's illegal So something that's not a nonconformity. Someone could potentially argue that prior to the zoning ordinance being adopted in 1950 something, because I can't nail down the date, that they had an accessory apartment in an accessory structure, that they are therefore a legal nonconformity. They would have to sort of prove that they've been consistently using that and it never expired over a 2-year period, but we'll leave that alone for a moment. And let's just say somebody went in and put in an accessory apartment in a detached garage 7 years ago. What do we do with that? The sample that we have from Roanoke is that if it is an illegal non-conforming structure, the property owners are required to go through the special exception process. And presumably they meet all the code requirements. So if there is an illegal accessory apartment in a detached structure, the proposal would be for those folks to have to go through the special exception process to make it legal.
And you know, that is our conditional use permit process anyway, kind of the whole thing that everybody else
Right.
has to go through.
So that brings in, if they can't meet the requirements,
Right.
then they don't get to have their accessory apartment. And then if they continue to occupy it, then it becomes a zoning enforcement issue. So
Do we
that's
have several of those?
none that I'm aware of at this time, but something like that will almost invariably pop up. So it would be good, and my recommendation to you would be to have some language like this in the code
Okay.
so that we would know how to deal with an illegal apartment in a separate structure.
So how would that be different or from what's in Bedford? Like, would you suggest adding that to the item from Bedford? I mean, it seems like Bedford is really just saying no, but if it's already an illegal non-conforming use or structure.
I'm not sure if I heard that correctly, but for me, it's what do you do with something that's just an illegal structure, an illegal use of a structure?
Yep.
So we would address that by saying you have to go through the conditional use permit process.
Or
But-
not allow it at all.
Correct. And
Which is what is
presumably
Bedford.
that if it can't meet, then you would, the conditional use permit process with all of the requirements for setbacks and all the other things, then yes, it would not be approved as a conditional use permit and therefore would be denied. And then the second part of that, I think, is something different. It's a non-conforming. It's a legal non-conforming structure that may be in the setback a little bit, the front yard setback, probably more likely a side yard or rear yard setback.
Mhm.
So that non-conforming structure, it's not 10 feet from the side property line in R1, it's 5 feet or it's on the property line. And we have a couple of examples of those in the appendix.
Mhm.
So what do you do with a non-conforming structure with respect to most likely setback violation? Then, so that is a little bit different than already having the illegal use in a structure
Mhm.
that doesn't meet.
So we would need both?
Oh, yeah, correct.
Yeah.
I didn't know if
okay.
you were trying to combine them necessarily with the language, but yes, my opinion, it would be helpful to have them both and
Yeah.
separately listed.
So Arnie, so the first one is an illegal use. An illegal accessory apartment. I'm I'm just trying to understand the definition of that in regards, and just to make clear the distinction that you're drawing between 1 and 2, which I think I get, but I just want to be sure.
Okay. Right now, we allow an accessory apartment, at least since 2017, in the main structure.
Mhm.
But if somebody, say, a number of years ago, just converted their garage without any approvals into an accessory apartment, not just a bathroom, not just a bedroom, but let's say bathroom, bedroom, kitchen, whole separate unit. And it's in a separate detached structure that therefore doesn't meet our current accessory apartment requirements because it has to be within the main structure. It is therefore an illegal use of that accessory structure. So what do we do with the illegal use? We say to make it right, you got to go through the conditional use permit process. And if you can't meet the requirements that we have in the conditional use permit process for setbacks and number of people, once we establish a number of residents in that, then you just
So then you would
And not-
say you cease and desist.
Correct. And if they continue, then it's a zoning enforcement
Right,
action.
okay. In that, just picking up on what you've said verbally, which I think is helpful. Do we want to add language in there to say that must meet the requirements? Something to that effect?
Yeah, it could be helpful. So at the end of the sentence, go through the special exception process and meet all the requirements thereof.
Okay,
The only thing about adding that, and we might get into it to the next part, because the next thing we're going to talk about is legal non-conforming structures. So they're not being used that way, but we might allow some allowances for those. Because if somebody's doing an illegal non-conforming structure, they have to cease and desist. But through the conditional use permit, we may not make them meet all the requirements. I think maybe we should discuss the second part before we add that sentence. Is that making sense? Are you seeing that?
I think so. Once we
And
get
nobody
there.
may agree with me and may think if it's any existing structure, we want that to meet all the current standards. I think that's the discussion we need to have first before we add that phrase.
Okay, so we'll put a little pin in that section, hopefully not forget that maybe we need to come back and add that language. So is everybody generally okay with the idea of if it's an illegal use, then they have to go through the conditional use permit process? Special exceptions and conditional uses are the same thing. They're just called different things in different jurisdictions. So my apologies for that.
So my question is, if somebody has a structure that's not attached to their main residence and it doesn't fit into the guidelines that we have established for this kind of apartment, can they then at any point in the future come to us and ask for this? They can then, what if somebody decides to build in a way that maybe they just decide to put a garage near their apartment or near their house, and then suddenly 10 years down the road, they decide they want to now expand it and make an apartment in there too, but it's not is that a way? Do we want to constrain it to only existing structures that are as of right now?
If I'm following correctly, if they were to build a garage, 3-car garage, happen to have some space above, never told us that it was going to be fitted out for a dwelling unit, that's perfectly fine. It would meet because we would make sure it meets the setback requirements, height requirements for an accessory structure without the accessory apartment. But if they came back in without our knowing it, put in the accessory apartment above the garage, and they were caught doing that at some point, if we were able to catch them, then they would have to meet the requirements at that time. We would then say you would have to go through the conditional use permit process. And if they happen to not meet the requirements that we have for that accessory apartment, then that's kind of on them and not on us, as far as we would say that they would have to vacate it, or they would have to take out the kitchen to make it conforming to the regulations. Does that answer your question? So I'm not sure that we want to say that you can only put an accessory dwelling unit in a detached structure that already exists. So there should be the allowance for new structures that are conforming with our code to be able to be constructed to house these accessory dwelling units.
No, I agree with that. I just don't know if somebody could then, I guess our new requirements aren't coming any. It maybe is a non-question because it couldn't happen, because if somebody was to build a new structure, it's necessarily going to meet our requirements for our auxiliary. So that's probably right.
Okay. So if we're okay with number 1, moving on to number 2, which is a situation where you have an existing accessory structure, maybe does not have, or likely does not have the unit in it, does not have the dwelling unit. Let's say it's too close to the side setback or the rear setback. What is it that you do with that structure? And there are a couple of examples here, one from Bedford, actually just one in this case. And their language is it says an accessory apartment may be permitted in a building other than the principal building, provided that A, the parcel meets the minimum lot size requirements for the district in which it is located. And B, the building in which it is located complies with all setback requirements for a principal building. So they're taking a hard line saying if it's an accessory structure, I misled you by saying that if it's within the setback, that wasn't the case. So you can only put an accessory dwelling unit in an accessory structure if it meets the requirements. So no leeway. That's one option.
Mhm.
Going over to the next page, allowing accessory apartments in legal non-conforming structures. Of course, it's always on the property owner to show or prove that they have a legal nonconformity. They have to show that it would exist as of a certain date. If we have questions on it have been continually used, which then they would have to provide that as well. There's a lot of language here from Arlington. I try to sort of focus a little bit more with the underlining. So accessory structures can be located in accordance with certain requirements. And then going to A, specifically detached accessory buildings existing prior to a certain date, presumably the date of the adoption of the ordinance that we're working towards, may be altered to make interior alterations, whether structural or non-structural, in accordance with all requirements of Article 16, and that's the non-conforming section for them, to create an accessory dwelling. So what they're saying there is, if you have a non-conforming structure, however it's non-conforming,
So for example, on the lot line.
correct?
Okay.
You can make internal structural and non-structural changes to it. So presumably that structure is already there in that configuration, the impacts are there. And in this case, it doesn't say anything about expanding it, at least in a non-conforming way, that the impacts are there and you're allowed to make structural and non-structural changes to put the accessory apartment into that structure that already exists. That's non-conforming in some way. Now, we may want to at some point figure out what non-conformities we're comfortable with and which ones we aren't, but we'll get to that.
And it's assumed that that'd be through everything is through the conditional use permit.
So far, all accessory dwelling units and detached structures are through the conditional use permit process. Yes.
So, but when you said that that the impacts are already there, I would disagree.
Okay, we've had that discussion
we
before,
have.
so I did overstate that. So at least the impacts from the building, but yes, adding the use, let's say it went from a garage and now you're putting
People.
living space in there, that you could argue certainly that impact is more intense and maybe over a longer period of time than just the car sitting in the garage or the canoe.
Absolutely.
Which is why it's good. It's all through conditional use because that does make a difference in some instances. In some instances, it doesn't, and it'd be satisfactory for it to be on or close to the lot line.
And then in subsection B there, any detached accessory building approved after the magic date has to comply with the requirements. So we already have most of that listed. We would just bring that forward. So it's not so important right now to go through 1, 2, and 3. It's just to know that if you have a non-conforming structure before the date, then it can be utilized. And then any new detached accessory building after the date of adoption of this ordinance has to meet all the requirements.
So this would fit very much into the one along, what is the road called? Limekiln Road. This is essentially, this would allow for that kind of accommodation where they have a garage, they want to make it into a living structure. It's non-conforming now. This would be satisfying.
Correct,
Or
because
would it though, wouldn't we be able to say you have to have a certain setback?
well, we can still add that, but right now in A, the underlined portion simply says detached accessory buildings existing prior to the date of adoption may be altered to make interior alterations, whether structural or non-structural, in accordance with all requirements of the non-conforming section, which basically means you can't make it worse, the non-conformity, to create an accessory dwelling. So there's nothing that says,
Gotcha.
unless you put it in, that is just, in my opinion, a wholesale allowance of whatever that non-conforming structure is.
Yep.
You can put a dwelling unit in. Now that also could be 1,400 square foot accessory structure.
Well,
Right.
yeah, that's what.
So that's the one that's permissive.
That feels too loosey-goosey.
Okay. Well, if you're okay, we'll go down to Loudoun County's example. Now, they, for some reason, really wanted to provide a whole lot of leeway for anything that's historic.
Right.
So don't pay attention too much in that first from 1 and 2, but it's clear for historic structures, they wanted to provide some leeway. So reading the underlined portion in 3, may be used as an accessory dwelling and shall be exempt from the floor area and the minimum lot area requirements specified above, provided that any expansion or enlargement of such structure shall not exceed 15% of the total floor area existing prior to the magic date. What I found interesting there is, let's say we have 800 square feet as our maximum, and let's say this accessory structure is 450, and do we provide an allowance of a certain percentage to get them something more? And as we've already heard from Mirabai, we also need to take into account if it's a really small structure and it's 25-40% of that, and it's maybe still too small, we might have to make an adjustment there. But I thought it was interesting, this construct that whatever the structure is, there's an allowance of up to maybe 15% increase. We'll have to see whether or not that makes sense for us. But that was the main takeaway, at least for me in that section. And then going over to the next page, I didn't underline it, but I probably should underline the last part of that sentence. But in Fauquier County, we're located in the RA or RC districts on at least 5 acres in size. You can tell that's a lot different than we are. And where a legally existing dwelling unit built before 2013 is being converted to an ADU, the unit may contain up to 1,400 square feet or square footage of existing unit, whichever is less. So there we can start putting parameters on whatever the size of the existing structure. Do we want to say if it is 1,600 square foot structure, we really don't want it to be any greater than 40% of, or a max of 800 square feet. So there wasn't any clear language that I could find that might suit us. So we're going to have to do a bit of crafting as far as figuring out where our comfort level is with nonconformities and how much of the structures can be utilized. So do we want to put any more requirements on a nonconforming structure? Because we're going to find them in all different ways as far as nonconforming with respect to setbacks. We'll also have to consider size of the structure. We may have larger structures than we're intending for ADUs in general. So that's really all I have as far as introduction or for nonconformities. And it might be helpful, as Matt's already gotten into our appendix that shows a couple of examples. I'm going to just flip to that since it was brought up on page 4. We do have a situation. You see the photograph on the top of the page there with Mirabai's house on the left and the accessory structure on the right. It is a carport type structure on the front end of the building. And then there's a kitchen in that back end of the building. And she's also provided us on the next page a floor plan of what would happen potentially if the carport gets filled in. So all of this is under the existing roof, but she admitted that it's also on the property line. So would there be comfort in allowing that accessory dwelling unit to go into a structure that is on the property line?
Not for me.
Well, that's why I think the conditional use permit is helpful, because not in every situation, but there may be cases. And then like if you look at page 6 on the one on Edmondson, it's the same situation, except that it backs up to an alley. And there's actually quite a few buildings on Edmondson cellars that do back up to an alley. So in those cases, it could make much more sense than I could see where the one on Lime Kiln, it all depends what the neighbors have to say about it. But
And on Lime Kiln, just an example, you could say that it's allowed to go into an accessory structure that's on the property line, as, and this may be going too far, maybe impinging upon the rights of the person next door, as long as the residence next door is at least 30 feet away. Or
Right, but then that puts the
Right.
burden on that next door neighbor property so that you get to have what you want, but then they have you know, maybe they wanted that extra, I don't know. It just seems really, it seems like we would be allowing for a level of compression that is where the burden is shared by somebody who is not making a financial benefit from this. It's just from the neighbor, and it's what you move into, and I just don't think that that's the right thing to do.
And in fact, it could be a net negative for the neighbor too.
Oh, yeah,
So it
big time.
could be an impact.
Absolutely.
I just don't know. And I hate that.
I would hope that in our conditional use permit that we would write some, if we allow non-conforming structures at all, that we would have something in there that sort of gives us some guidance on how to address the situation and not just rely on a neighbor to show up or not to show up.
Right.
Some standards.
Because plenty of people can't make a 5 o'clock meeting. Plenty of people don't really read the paper and pay attention to that sort of thing. I think that that's just,
This may not be helpful, but I have to add it. We would, for a conditional use permit, provide adjacent property owner letters and also provide a nice yellow sign on the property, but not everybody sees all the yellow
and
signs or
sometimes
pays
people go
attention to
away
their
on
mail. So,
vacation.
true.
On, can you explain on, the White Street, page 8? So it looks like that's the same situation as far as being on lot line. I'm not quite clear which one would be an accessory dwelling, you know,
Yeah.
Like both of them.
This property is a very large in-town property, so there will not, in my opinion, be any issue with putting in an accessory dwelling unit if they're allowed on the property. He has pushed it all the way to 5 feet of the rear property line. So I'm not sure if you're confused with the shadow from on the back side of the property that you see. That's
that's a
actually on the
shadow.
adjacent property and not an existing structure, as I understand it. As I think author explained to me, mind you, it's been a while ago, that everything that you see is new in that L-shaped, except for, sorry, I wish we had all this on. There is one little structure along Alexander Lane,
Mhm.
so that he is incorporating that and showing that a little bit different. So that would become an office, and then there's a breezeway that connects it to the 2-car garage and the accessory dwelling. So the 2-car garage and the accessory dwelling that's shown, it would all be new construction. So this is not an example of a nonconformity.
And do you know this? Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
The house behind it then, so that little shed that has the shadow, is that a shed or is that something that's big enough to be an accessory dwelling unit for them?
It's a garage, and I cannot recall if it's a 1-car or if it's a 2-car garage from walking through the alley. But yes, that's a good point, that would be a nonconformity that
Yeah.
you have to consider.
Right.
The non-conformity being that this would be built too close to it.
Well, I was gonna say more, if they wanted to turn that into an ADU, it'd be a non-conforming. Yeah.
That little garage outside of the yellow.
So
box.
not the one, okay, not, okay.
So yeah. So this one has enough of a setback, is that right?
He wants, for what we have now, it has
What we
5
have.
feet, but I want to come back around to that later on. So I'm not
Right.
comfortable with 5
So,
feet.
right, so is 5 feet enough is, I guess,
Right now, an accessory building,
It's Alexander
a
Street.
shed or garage could be up as close as 5 feet from the rear property line.
And that's the new ADU also.
There's one little interpretation that has to be made here is once you attach all this with the breezeway, is it a detached or not? I would argue that it's not, but if it keeps a foot of the breezeway from not attaching this
This is present.
accessory structure, then we could be fine.
If there's anything.
Which that is a good argument for keeping all of our regular setbacks, including the rear yard setback to 25 feet it's 25 feet for all zones, pretty much for residential, isn't it?
For the main structure.
Yes, and that's what I mean, because and I am, the more I think about this, the more I would rather have 25 feet for anything. You know, we've kind of used in some of our discussion, well, if you can do that by expanding the main house, then that makes sense, you know, to have those setbacks. But you couldn't expand your main house back to 5 feet of it So I'm not quite clear why we would allow a ADU just to have a rear setback of 5 feet, but that's a later discussion I want to come back around to, but
And I think, did we not address a little bit of that? We
Yeah, didn't
we did,
sort of
but
say
some, a little bit
on
more
the
than
sides, not
5.
on the back.
I can't remember if it's sides or back. But yeah, it's a good point to come back to. Well,
Yeah.
we'll come back to all of this after
Yeah.
it's put together in one. So right now, I guess it's more of a question of sort of the bigger picture on the
Right.
nonconformities. Do you want to just say they're not allowed unless it's in a conforming structure? Or do you want to allow them in non-conforming structures and just as they are, or allow them in non-conforming structures with some qualifiers, some standards that go along with it?
Some qualifiers might be good, like an alley. I mean, I kind of see an alley as somewhat meeting a setback.
Right, alleys definitely feel different to me, but side yards and
Yeah.
rear yards that are not on an alley don't.
Yeah, I
Because,
could
you know,
see-
you could have a playground back there and then for your kids. And then have somebody's house right there.
Right.
Would it be helpful to go through maybe in more detail? We talked about Mirabai's, but maybe the one on page 6, which is the 30 Edmondson Avenue. Just to take you through that one, that's one that came before the Board of Zoning Appeals, I think it was. But the photograph on top is showing Ross Lane.
Mhm.
So the alleyway that goes up as really Ross Road extended. And it's a little bit hard to tell here, but my guess is the back portion of that formerly agricultural building is on the property line.
Yeah.
And then you see the alley that runs between the two parcels that is still owned by the one person, but there's an alleyway in between. It's also very close to the side property line, which is abuts that alleyway.
And I do like you mentioned one of these examples having a maximum square footage too. So that might be a parameter we consider for these non-conforming. That is, only so much of it can be used for living space.
This is a good example of that. And it's been a while. So if I'm not mistaken, it was more than 750 square feet in size. So, and then they were waiting for this process to go along to see how many square feet, but they also had the issue with the upper floor was peaked. So how much of the peaked area do you count or do you not count? So that's the next item, a cleanup item that comes after nonconformities. But if you have a structure that's bigger, then do you have to say, well, you can only use 800 square feet of that. And then the extra 200 square feet or whatever ends up being cannot be utilized for this. It has to be for storage for the main. Oh, yeah. We'll have to figure out how to, and that will be clear enough in the conditional use permit process once they provide us a floor plan and we tell them it has to be no more than, I presume, 800, because that's sort of the figure that we've set so far. But yes, it would have to meet that requirement if it's put in.
So one thing that I think about when I look at this sort of barn looking structure is how, and I know this alley, how sort of remote it would feel. And I know that the kids walk up and down it. And I wonder about that, that it's one of those things about there's sidewalks on streets and there's a setback from the sidewalk or from the street anyway. Is that something that's worth considering, I guess, is the question that I would ask, is the question of, do we want to say that the door does not open onto the alley? I'm just sort of thinking about, I don't know, sort of a,
Or access to, traffic. I wouldn't think you'd want, access to this building right off of the alley. The alleys aren't made for that type of traffic.
although plenty of alleys do have garages that open onto
Yeah.
them.
Mhm.
And I think what I'm hearing from both of you is you don't want a back door coming right out on, or the front door stepping out into
yes.
the alley, which
I
is a
think that
safety
that's,
issue.
yes.
That's what I'm hearing. Which is a good point.
Is that not, didn't we already discuss that earlier with where the front door has to be? And if it's an accessory dwelling unit, where is the mailbox? Did we? Yeah.
We did talk in section 9 about orientation of entrance.
Yeah.
So this is where we're beginning to test.
Mhm.
Yeah.
We're talking about future proofing
So
and
let's
I
see.
think that in Lexington, I can imagine that maybe some of the early requests to do this will be existing garages and structures. Probably a high percentage of them are not conforming.
Mhm.
So that's our challenge.
Could I ask if there's any appetite to consider allowing an accessory dwelling unit in a structure that is non-conforming? Or is there more of a preference that no, if it's going to be a structure, it has to meet our current requirements for size, for setbacks, for height?
But if it doesn't meet, say, one of those parameters, they still have the option of getting a conditional use permit. No.
No, not the way we've written it so far. You can write a conditional use permit with requirements and allow some latitude in that, but right now we're just saying it's a conditional use permit and it has to meet the requirements that we've put down in writing so far. I'm just trying to get an idea of whether there is any appetite to actually allow some sort of leeway for non-conforming structures, or no, an accessory dwelling unit in a detached structure has to meet our current setback and height and
So,
lot size.
so if we say, no, I have no appetite, does that mean if there is an existing unit in a non-conforming, does that mean it's just no longer allowed, or how does that work?
I'm sorry, did you say if there's actually a unit already in it?
Yeah. Oh, and it's being operated in this way right now.
Well, if it's being operated that way now, it's going to be illegal because we don't allow them.
Okay.
So they would have to go through the conditional use permit process and they wouldn't get it and they wouldn't even need to go through the conditional use permit process, quite honestly, because it wouldn't be allowed. If we're going to be of a strict interpretation that says a detached accessory unit has to meet all the requirements, then Mirabai would not be able to, as an example, with her structure, be able to put in an accessory apartment. So I'm wondering if that's where we want to start, or if that's where we want to end up, which I think was Bedford's example, or just trying to figure out what path we want to take.
Yeah.
Or do we want to allow some flexibility with non-conformities?
I would be fine with that. Yeah, I guess I don't want to rule out. It just depends. I feel like it's situational. It really depends on
Mhm.
where the nonconformity is and how much it impacts neighbors and the public right of ways and all that stuff. I think that's completely conditional on a case by case basis, which is why I thought we had conditional use. Sorry.
Maybe
I guess I thought I understood the differences between section A and B here.
You mean 1 and 2?
1 and 2, sorry, yeah, Roanoke and Bedford, but now I'm back to not understanding what part 1 is then.
that's simply something that's illegal. It's already a dwelling unit that's in an accessory structure that's detached. And if they
Just
could prove
existing,
that it
yeah.
was there since 1950 something, then it's a non-conformity, but otherwise it's illegal. So what do we do with it when it's illegal?
It mostly helps with enforcement. It really,
Yeah, okay,
right, it's
okay.
not really going to change how you implement this.
My guess is we're not going to come across many of those, if that helps.
Yeah, I think about Stonegate on Main Street had the main building and had the carriage house that now the owners are living in. I guess that had been being used as a dwelling unit. But so you look at that and it makes perfect sense. I mean, it hasn't been We
Yeah.
heard no negative comments about it. So I do see
Right,
that there are
like,
definitely
yeah.
situations where you could have a non-conforming structure and it could work well as a,
Yeah,
accessory
I mean,
dwelling.
say your lot backed up against the examples people have used alleyway or parks and open space. If there's not an immediate, I don't know. I guess I'm just saying it would be situational and how egregious to me
Mhm.
so that's why I say I don't want to just fell swoop say, nope, not allowed.
Is that roughly everybody's opinion as well?
Again, that,
I just say, the way Arnie phrased it was, do you have an appetite to say, no non-conforming structures are allowed, may have an accessory apartment. And I would say, I'd probably want to, allow a little bit of flexibility if it's, if it's a non-offensive, to the public or to a neighbor situation. That's where I would allow a little flexibility.
So some flexibility if there's conditions.
yes, I would,
That-
I would agree with Blake. Yeah. What
So-
is Article 16 under the sample from Arlington County? I tried to find it today.
I think I looked it up before. I think that's their general non-conforming section. So we would do the same thing and say it's section 18 or which one it is. There's going to be a different section that says generally this is how you handle non-conformities, non-conforming lots, non-conforming uses. Generally, it says you cannot expand the non-conformity.
So if we took B there, number 1 on interior lots, this goes to Mirabai's example. The nearest wall of the accessory building should not be located closer than 5 feet to a side or rear lot. I mean, that's pretty tight. But and I know Shannon is concerned about that in her own, and so that's just one example of I think of how they're trying to allow some flexibility. And it doesn't meet the standard setback requirements.
Another thing that could be done, let's say, just to use Mirabai's example, that she's on the property line. And let's say we put in a 5-foot side setback in that case for accessory dwelling unit, which is less than what's required in the zoning district, but for an example.
Right.
She still has the ability, it's a no for her because she doesn't have the 5 feet, but she could potentially still do a boundary line adjustment if the neighbor agrees to it, as long as moving the boundary line over that much doesn't violate any of the setbacks that are required for their property. So just be aware that
Mhm.
it may not be a hard no, it may be a no, but there is a potential in certain situations for boundary lines to be adjusted to accommodate.
I certainly would be okay with the boundary line adjustment option if the neighbors are willing to do that. But I think there really have to be setbacks. That's whether it's exactly the same setbacks for a house as it is as for an ADU. I'm not as clear on that, but I do feel pretty strongly about the need for a setback.
Maybe I'm just confused, but in general, confused, but what about the garage that's sitting on the alley that doesn't have any setback?
Yeah, that's, yeah.
Does that mean they now have to go through a borderline?
Actually, so an alley to me is a little different, although that's where like my concern about the alley would be having an entrance on the back on the alley,
Have what?
having the door, having a door on the alley. So I would say that if you have an ADU on an alley, that it would need to have a side entrance. Side or facing the front of the
Mhm.
lot, as
Shannon,
opposed
does
to
number 3 answer that question?
number 3.
Under the B of Arlington, the nearest wall 20 feet from any street or officially designated. Shall not be located any closer.
So the nearest wall not located.
So that means that that structure we're looking at on Edmondson wouldn't qualify.
That's correct.
That'd be fine for a regular.
But maybe that's where we get into the distinction of making an additional accommodation for alleyways as opposed to
Right.
streets.
Yeah.
And we do have a definition of alley in the zoning ordinance, but we don't have a map that I'm aware of that says these are your primary roads and these are your secondary roads and these are your alleys.
And for now, I would be fine with just leaving it at if you have an alley, but keep all your other setbacks. I mean, I'd have to see some example. I mean, I don't want to upset Mirabai, but I don't see that as being compelling that we shouldn't enforce side setbacks, because I do agree with you. And I have seen that case. I think when we started this, I told you that happened to my mother-in-law. All of a sudden, right next to
Yeah.
with no setback was an accessory dwelling unit. And you're right, it changes everything, more activity, lighting, all that. So it is a big change to have that. So I don't know that but I do think I would like to allow some flexibility if if it backs up to an alley. I haven't seen a case yet where I thought, oh, that would make no sense. Just
On an
walking through
alley.
the neighborhoods. Yeah, on
Yeah,
an alley.
Right.
Do we need to perhaps craft something for non-conforming structures? So that just going off the top of my head at the moment, but detached accessory buildings is existing as of a certain date may be altered to make interior alterations, structural, non-structural, in accordance with all requirements of the non-conforming section, to create an accessory dwelling unit as long as, and then we start adding at least 5 feet to the side property lines, or and then something about alleys. Does that make sense to start crafting some conditions for approval? It can go into a non-conforming structure as long as, and then there might be quite a long list
Yeah.
that goes along with that.
Mhm.
I think that would make sense.
Does it make sense right now to go through and at least spitball what those would be? We've talked
Yeah,
about
sure.
setback for sides, alleyway entrances, reduction there. Is there anything else? And I know it's hard to just sort of come up with these, like you're trying to picture an instance or an example, but is there anything else that comes to mind immediately?
What's your sense of lot size and lot width
in the
for an
sense?
ADU?
So right now, I'm not sure if this is the question, but or is the question that in an R1 zoning district, if you have a less than the 60 feet that's required, could you still put in an accessory dwelling unit that's detached?
As long as it met
Yeah, I think it's more,
the setbacks.
yeah. In my mind, it may be not so important what the width is
Hmm.
as it is the distances from said structure to whatever else is
Yeah.
property lines
yep.
or.
Right. I definitely feel like the setbacks are the critical piece there. I mean, but particularly because we're limiting the size of the ADU substantially.
And that would be something, and we talked about a minute ago, on our list of things for the non-conforming is a maximum living area. Designation.
We
Yeah.
could pick that up from our 800 or 40%, whatever we had
Yeah.
previously.
Mhm.
Okay, so we can start putting that list
Mhm.
together, the exceptions or conditions list. But right now, from what I've heard, I think I've only heard of a few. We can also certainly add on to that once we come back to this. But is that satisfactory for now?
I think a height limit as well, like in the sample from Arlington in number 3.
Yeah. We have
Says-
somewhere else a story and a half or 25 feet. I'll have to find it, but
So then just maybe a statement about that it has to meet the requirements or the limitations of an ADU
correct. As
or
in-
all of the above. whatever.
Just for the record, for number 7, it says detached accessory buildings containing accessory dwellings shall exceed neither 25 feet nor 1.5 stories in height. But depending on where we put things, it could be good to have it listed again, or that's the place where it's actually listed.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, yeah, Arnie, I think it'd be good for you to come back with that list. And to me, the Arlington one starts to make more sense. And I like the fact that it differentiates between corner lots, for example, on number 2, and going back to Leslie's example, and the nearest edge of the eave of the accessory building shall not be located closer than 10 feet to any rear lot line. So it means that you're not going to have a tall structure, right? 5 feet from your lot line. I think that's what I'm reading there, but
Yeah.
Just to be clear, we haven't really gone through 1, 2, and 3.
why don't we?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
that's it. So we have some of this, not all of this already partially decided. We've got placeholders for them. So, but we can certainly go through if anything else fancies your interest in 1, 2, and 3.
So I do have a question about the nearest wall of the accessory building. How does a bay window fit into that?
Mm.
We have,
We've talked about bays. Oh, when we did an amendment for allowing certain or minimal encroachments into setbacks, there was an exception for bay windows as long as they weren't more than, I can't remember if it's 10 feet in width or what it was. It can come up to 3 feet, I think, from into the setback. So we already have something in the yards section of the code that addresses bays that we could pull for. Oh, it's already there. So whatever we write for here, do we want to abide by that, or do we want to amend that for accessory structures?
I would say amend it, because if you've only got a 5-foot line and you've got a 3-foot bay window, then you have a 2-foot
Right.
setback.
And it's not as, I'm not saying it right. It's not as bad as that, but hopefully. In section 420 4.2 areas and yards, C4, projecting horizontal architectural features. Architectural features such as windowsills, belt courses, chimneys, cornices, eaves, roof overhangs, bay windows, or canopies may project not more than 3 feet into any required setback, but no closer than 5 feet to any lot line.
Yeah, okay.
A window which is not more than 10 feet wide may extend 3 feet into a required yard.
But still,
yeah.
Yep. Then
So
that
if you want
addresses
anything
it.
different than that, then it would have to go in.
So
specifically.
given that is you said that's a 10-foot setback, or just whatever the setback is?
Whatever the setback is,
Okay.
and then this gives you an allowance to have some minimal encroachments into that required setback,
Okay.
be it front, side, or rear.
Except you have to stay within at
5
least,
feet, yeah.
And then if it comes to be that you want an accessory structure to have at least 10 feet, in that case, then you put in something that says at least 10 feet to any lot line.
okay.
Anything else for non-conformities?
So you're gonna come up with the list for us to
Well,
look at.
a draft list from what we've heard this evening, and then we can certainly go through that at the next meeting and then add on to that list. Do you need anything else?
So which one did we end up with? Are we happy with the Arlington or
Well, what
the?
I read from was Arlington, that underlined portion of subsection A.
Yeah.
And then with the exception of, and then we'll have a list of things there.
Okay. I'm fine with that.
Yep, sounds good.
Is there anything else that you need? Pictures of other non-conformity structures or anything else that would be helpful as you're going through this? Non-conformities are going to be the hard part, because you're dealing with things that exist and the impacts and how you
Right.
make it work.
And we want to our job is to make it easier for the people who come after us to make decisions, right?
Absolutely.
I just want to, I don't think I can, I'm not thinking of anything else that I need pictures of, but I did want to note that that we had talked about coming back to number 1, the sample from Roanoke, and talking about whether we want this to meet all requirements. Somebody had suggested that.
Does it make sense for us to put that in now as a placeholder and then provide the other language that we just talked about? And then if you see it together, might have a better sense of whether it's needed or not.
Yeah. Can you put that in like this yellow highlighting so we recognize that it's,
I think we have that capability.
Yeah, you've been doing it.
that'd be helpful just to know that we need to pay attention to it.
Almost everything needs to be highlighted yellow, but yes. Since it's still all a draft, yes.
Right.
If there's nothing else on nonconformities until the next meeting, when most of this comes back, I will go on to page 19, additional items to consider. And one's really just a note, but one thing to consider is in sample from Fauquier County. And I just wanted to bring this forward because we've talked about square footage, no more than 750 and no more than 800. Well, what is actually counted in that square footage allotment? And here they have something that's fairly specific. For purposes of this provision, square feet shall be calculated as the sum of the total horizontal areas of all floors of the building measured from the interior faces of exterior walls. Rooms with structural headroom of less than 6 feet 6 inches shall not be counted, nor shall garage space provided the area of the garage does not exceed the counted floor area. Covered porches, balconies, etc., shall not be counted unless they are enclosed, but shall not exceed 50% of the area of the counted floor. This, I'm not saying this is all exactly the way we need it, but I like having something in there that when somebody brings an accessory dwelling unit to me and it's got a porch that's not enclosed, do I count it? Do I not count it? There's a deck there that has 800 square feet of deck. Is it counted? Is it not counted?
Does building code specify a height for a floor?
I think it's 5 feet 5. Is there like once it gets to a certain height or below that, then it's not really counted as usable square footage. Is there some around 5 feet?
But in terms of habitable,
Right.
6'8".
It is. Okay.
Okay. Because I was just afraid by putting that 6'6", you'd encourage people to make a substandard space, but as long as there's a building code that requires you to be above that. Of course, 6'6" for me would be fine, but for
Yeah.
some of y'all.
You think of, because we're talking about a story and a half,
Yeah.
25 feet or a story and a half. So they're going to be under the eaves.
Right.
So at what point, do you count or not count square footage?
Right. No, I think I like this language in general.
Okay, so we'll add, if everybody's generally okay with that, it can be obviously Smith once we understand it a little bit more. There's a lot of detail in there, but I think it's helpful to have something that directs how the square footage is counted.
Can you highlight the rooms with structural headroom of less than 6.6 shall not be counted? I want to give some thought to that, but I'm not sure I'll remember to come back to it.
And the last thing, there's just a note to reiterate the accessory cannot be constructed without the primary dwelling existing on the parcel. I think that's in our accessory structure or in the part that handles accessories, but just might be helpful to have it here. We're not in maybe resort communities. Sometimes people go and build the garage with the accessory apartment above before they spend money on building the house. And we have not allowed that because of another section of the code that says you can't have the accessory without having the primary use there. Somebody tried to put in a parking lot once on a vacant residential parcel. I said that would be an accessory use to the structure, but the dwelling unit's not there. Therefore, you cannot put it in the parking lot. So I think it would just be helpful to have that
So
reiterated.
could somebody, okay, so 2 questions. Are tiny houses allowed in Lexington?
And not in the sense that I think of tiny houses, which mean they're on wheels. people get around the building code, and we have an architect, so I have backup. If I'm saying something wrong, please correct me. But for us, a structure has to be tied to a permanent foundation in the building code. So people get around if there are minimum house sizes, people just put the thing on wheels and cart it around in an X as an RV, which would be allowed in an RV park. We would not allow somebody to build a house on a trailer where the wheels stay permanently attached and it's carted around. So if they brought it to a building site and they pulled it off of the wheels and put it on a permanent foundation, yes, because we do not have a minimum building area for a dwelling unit. Now, there are code requirements, as I understand it, in the building code that says you're supposed to have so many square feet for this, that, and the other. But we do not have in the zoning ordinance anything that says dwelling unit cannot be less than 500 square feet or 1,000. We've had in Thompson's Knoll, I think 900 square foot houses built,
Mhm.
just as an example.
So, okay, so let's say somebody had done that and they made a tiny house, they came in, they put it down on a foundation. Now they've got a very small house on a big lot. And then somebody buys it from them. And the new owners actually want to build like a big house. And then call the tiny house the ADU. Is that
So
something
in
that
the
could
first
happen?
case, it was the primary, it was just small.
Yeah,
And then the second case, then they would have to abide by our code. Probably get the conditional use permit for the thing that already existed,
mhm,
but make sure that they put the new structure, the bigger primary structure in such a way that it met the requirements,
Right.
setbacks, but also that percentage thing. So we'd kind of have to reverse calculate that. But yes, I believe it can be
potentially.
done.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Before we close on this, would it be helpful for us to go back to the beginning and for Arnie to walk us through without us getting into a debate?
Good luck with that. No.
I know. But to go through and highlight, and some of it's already there in yellow, what it is that we should be thinking about as we review this, as we get towards the end, so.
I mean, some of the placeholders that we put in.
Yeah, and anything that we think that we should be thinking about before we get back together again, mainly the placeholders, which were questions.
Okay, is everybody good with that? I'm gonna start where we just finished. We're gonna need the placeholder, everything in nonconformities.
Right.
And then going back to the beginning, just on page 13 as an example, what you see highlighted there, we have definitions that say that accessory unit is intended for occupancy of not more than X number of folks. So that's something to consider. I think some of them had not more than two folks or residents, and some of them were three, and I can't remember what else we had. So that's something to keep in mind. I don't think there was anything specifically on the use matrix because so far we've been fairly standard or keen on having all of them be conditional uses. After reviewing some of the general standards on page 15, I have a couple of items that I may add and may highlight. But then going down to the size of the ADUs, the last sentence, additionally, detached accessory buildings and structures cumulatively shall not occupy more than blank % of the rear yard. So sort of not an open space requirement, but a way of keeping a certain amount of the area open. There, we had a question mark for that. In the setbacks, I think we had what is this? I should not to the side lot line, but then we came back and thought, well, maybe it could be less in certain instances. So you have 15 feet, but then you have or 10. So there was some consideration perhaps or reconsideration there of standards that had already been sort of agreed to, at least temporarily.
Yeah, I did think was interesting on that Washington Post article about the size of the ADUs for California.
Mhm.
They said a minimum of 800 square feet, which I'm assuming means that no matter what the size of your house is, you can at least have one that was 800 square feet. But then a maximum of 1,200 square feet. It was just instead of just setting one, it was a higher limit than ours. It was just something worth considering.
And then getting back to the sizes, if the building is too small, did you want to set a floor at a minimum? And so
Right now, 800.
Where would that go?
On the maximum?
Yeah. We have them.
so in size,
Under here we have.
that's when Blake reminded us that math is important.
Mhm.
These two.
Oh,
And
here, yeah.
750.
well, what else was there?
750 for attached and 800 for detached.
And the on page 17, that highlighted portion accessory dwellings shall not be
Mhm.
included in calculations of density. Can't remember why that was necessarily highlighted because I thought we had agreed. Maybe there was some agreement, but maybe there was still a question there.
Is that in our existing code? Is that what I saw?
No, I think we picked that up. I have a recollection that we picked that up from someplace else.
What, was it highlighted because we wanted to have a conversation about density and whether we needed to have some, or,
I have to go back and listen. We'll
Yeah.
figure that out. I don't recall at the moment.
I don't understand
then-
why it wouldn't be considered part of density. But I don't want to start to talk about density right now at all.
But we don't have any
and
limits on,
there, that's why
well-
it's highlighted.
But
we don't have any limits on density, do we? Yeah, that's why. So, yeah.
Yeah, we don't have, yeah.
So that really doesn't, and I remember when we
We don't have
talked
any
about
limits,
that, I
but I
thought you
mean-
had recommended it just in case something for the future, and I can't remember what it was, but
Yeah.
seems like we
Yeah,
don't need
right.
that.
we don't have limits, but also it's good to have data, like what is that?
So if you had a maximum so many dwelling units per acre, that would be for the main structures. You don't want to then count the accessories in it as well. Then you have fewer units. So I think that's just something that we pulled from one of the other ones, and I will find out why it was highlighted.
I guess, in case we ever added a
It could
density.
be easily that it was just something that may be a good thing to have, so we don't get into a problem with overall density. And we had the discussions on sizes, so there's still a question mark, at least in my mind. We put in 40% and 800 square feet and 750 for something else as placeholders, but I think that was another item that maybe we still need to pay attention to see if that's the right size. It is pointed out, maybe there's a minimum needed as well, a minimum also for percentage for Mirabai as an example, and not to always use her, but that's just an example because we have it. Is there anything else?
Isn't there something, Shannon, you had wanted to put a pin in something with regard to the use of an ADU on the property line non-conforming because you were worried that if, for example, if a garage, which was non-conforming, all of a sudden became a residence, that different use that may affect getting a conditional use permit, or was that a consideration? Where didn't you mention that at the very beginning?
I was gonna say that was not today.
But that was the discussion we had today. You
Well,
mentioned at the
We,
beginning.
we
but
talked
yeah.
about it,
Yeah,
but
it was, I thought it arose from either the Roanoke City or the Bedford County.
are you talking about, well, all right, sorry.
She did ask me to highlight.
Yeah.
Next, in the next packet.
I think I asked Kate
Okay,
to
okay,
highlight the
okay,
things
okay.
that,
No, I just wanted to make sure that's being highlighted.
and sorry, I thought you were talking about an earlier time that I had brought up the garage because
No.
apparently that's a thing for me.
I can't think of anything else specific that
Arnie, I came across an article. No, it's a short report written by, well, it's a local one, George Mason, Center for Regional Analysis and Housing Forward, Virginia. I was going to send it to you, and if the rest of the commission would like it, it's easy to read and it has some larger trends in there for Virginia, which I think would be useful as we get to the end of when we do the final review.
And does it talk about rural, sort of
Mm.
small towns? Or
No,
is it really,
Blacksburg is the closest to, and they do Fairfax. Those are who they talk to. But I think some of the literature review and the experience review, unfortunately in larger cities, but it is interesting to read. I mean, for example, on affordability, why we say it can help in affordability, the experience is most affordability comes really only in the cases they're documenting when it's family or friends who are living in it. But otherwise it'll be market rate.
Yeah.
So it's not really affordable in that
Right.
sense.
Right.
And then the other thing that's in here that we've talked about is this restrictions on short-term rentals is pretty standard. The difficulty is enforcing it. And anyway, there's a few, if you want, I'll even highlight them in yellow before I send them to you.
Send them, John, send them all. It's literally, all it costs is an email. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
we're okay
Do
with
that.
that.
That'd be
Yeah.
great.
Okay, so for next meeting in 2 weeks, you'll have some rough draft, and we're not at this point asking a bigger picture public to weigh in. No, we want to get
I don't
this,
think we've gotten to that point.
we want to get a better draft before we present it. Okay.
I'd like to provide to you what we just talked about the next meeting. I'll also put it into more of a ordinance format for you to see, and it's already included in the back just as a preview. And so you'll see it still highlighted ordinance format with a couple of options for nonconformities.
Great. Cool. Excellent. Thank you to everybody. Let's open up public comment. I think I saw a tumbleweed and some crickets. All right, we're going to close public comment. And that concludes that for the day. And now let's go to other business. First item is zoning and planning report.
As it turns out, we will not be applying in unison with other people in the region for a charging and fueling infrastructure grant in this round. There will be at least 2 more rounds, and that's for electric vehicle charging stations. That grant specifically required, I think it was either 500,000 or 700,000 minimum, and Harrisonburg dropped out as a partner. And we just didn't have enough other folks with a sufficient number of charging stations to get to that minimum amount. And that was a really short turnaround because the policies were just handed down. We knew the money was coming, but the guidelines took a while to get to us. But there will be at least 2 more rounds for that. So I envision we will be partnering again with the Central Shenandoah Planning District Commission on a charging and fueling infrastructure grant next year at this time.
I would be interested to find out who succeeded in getting those. I'm kind of curious about what the populations are, what the traffic is, what communities are really pursuing this.
Mhm.
So that would be.
And we learned a lot about level 2 chargers versus level 3 DC fast chargers. So there's a lot to learn if you have no background and don't have an electric vehicle. An electric bike is cool, but it's not quite the same thing as an electric vehicle. So I'm hopeful that in the next round we'll be part of that application. Recently attended a Chamber of Commerce Governmental Affairs Roundtable, my counterparts from BV and from Rockbridge County. And also today attended the final regional housing study training session that had to do with the local real estate assessment data. That's all I have for a zoning report.
I have a random question about zoning in the entrance corridor, as I've noticed like facelifts to certain storefronts that feel like that would have been something that planning commission would have looked at first, but is happening. Is that?
Yeah, I need to get in touch with the property manager for that shopping center to see what is going on, because I was just made aware of that maybe yesterday and saw it today. There are some improvements, if you will,
Sure.
being made.
Sorry, where is this?
The pack and mail,
Oh, yeah.
and they basically they ripped off all the siding and under construction, which is it's fine, but I guess I just thought that like we have to like approve every little paint color that happens in that entrance corridor. So,
Possible they'll put the gray siding right back on top of that.
okay.
But I don't know if that's true. So I need to contact them
Yeah.
and see.
I was just wondering if that was like a future item of new business. Cool.
I have one question for Arnie on planning and zoning. I've heard that WNL is going to be building a new health center. Do they need a conditional use permit for that? Okay.
They've been made aware twice now that that building along Denny Lane is not in the campus master plan that was recently approved. And it will need to either come through as an update or as a conditional use permit. It'll probably come in as a conditional use permit because it's a single parcel or a single project specific thing. And it'll probably come in as a CUP. They would like to get started on that structure in January. So
Semi-related, were we also going to be seeing a CUP for the Williams School
Site
demolition,
plan.
the site plan? Okay,
Site
because
plan.
I thought that they had to make adjustments to like the height of the roof and all that they needed to come back to us first. Is that not true?
they do.
Okay.
We still have one outstanding question and we've gone through 3 reviews thus far. So it's likely to be on maybe not the first meeting, but maybe the second meeting in June, once we get that one final item addressed.
Cool.
And then it will go to council because it's within 200 feet of the boundary and or along a public road. So that's one of the really unusual cases where a site plan goes to council.
Great. All right, we're on to key annual PC milestones. We have zoning text amendments. Anything there? Comp plan review, anything there? Any updates on big projects coming down the pipeline? No? All right, city council report.
City Council met on Thursday, May 18th, and we unanimously approved the zoning ordinance amendment requiring minimum lot width requirements for multifamily dwelling units and asked the city attorney to review portions of our discussion on this topic. And then at our next meeting on June 1st, the city manager will explain the process and results of the request for qualifications for this VDOT property on Waddell Street. One submission was received from Echelon Resources for a mixed-use development of 200 apartments and retail space. And council will have a work session to hear a presentation on the proposal from the developer on Monday, June 5th at 7 p.m. in the police department training room. That's all I have unless there's questions.
Why did you guys, what are you having the lawyer check over with regard to your discussions?
It came up in public comment, our discussion on on the lot width about whether a conditional use permit could be used in that way. Or whether we had the latitude, I would say.
The discretion was
Yeah,
there or
discretion, right.
not, as
Yes.
I maintained that it was. But
Yes.
it was requested that the city attorney review whether or not when you have a conflicting situation between 2 standards, does the conditional use permit allow you the latitude to make an approval with that conflict?
Okay. Thank you for that, Leslie. Any other items of business before we adjourn? All right, seeing none, I'm going to ask for motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Great. We'll see you next time. All in favor?
Aye.
All right, there you go.
Thank you all.